Now, Sudan's crisis continues as the war rages on with less attention. Tell us what you have witnessed so far, particularly in West Darfur.
So the humanitarian situation in Sudan is an absolute catastrophe, and there's no end in sight because the fighting continues both in Khartoum, the country's capital, and in the Darfur region. And it's extremely concerning for humanitarian organizations like the World Food Program, because these are populations that were already so vulnerable with high levels of food insecurity. And now they're being pushed from their homes, having to endure these horrific events now almost 9 months into the conflict. And urgent support is needed. And WFP is on the ground. We've managed to have breakthroughs in accessing West Darfur from the Chad border, where we've supported people with emergency food assistance, around 360,000 people. But that is very small compared to the needs. So we urgently need more access to these very, very vulnerable populations that are bearing the brunt of this horrific conflict.
What concerns you most, Leni, when it comes to women and girls?
What concerns us most at WFP is these rising levels of hunger and rising levels of malnutrition, especially among children that are under 5 or pregnant and breastfeeding women. And the conflict is exacerbating what was already a dire food security situation before the conflict started. And we're looking at around 20.3 million people who are hungry, who do not know where their next meal would come from. And of those, 6.3 million are in emergency levels of hunger, which means just one step away from famine. And these are people that are in the conflict hotspots, where it's the most difficult for aid agencies like WFP to get through. And this is concerning because if we are not able to provide support, then the hunger crisis will only deepen in the coming months or in the coming year.
And what kind of challenges are you facing as humanitarian organizations in Sudan? You know, with the ongoing war, there's all kinds of fears. What are you faced with?
So the first biggest challenge that we have is access, especially, as I mentioned, where fighting is ongoing in Khartoum, where there are airstrikes and shelling, where the fighting is pushing further south and reaching new areas. In these kind of active conflict zones, it makes it extremely unsafe for aid agencies and for humanitarians to be on the ground. And as I mentioned, this is where people need us the most. And so we are appealing to both parties to the conflict to have a humanitarian pause that is actually lasting, so that we can push through to these areas where people are most affected, where they need us right now. And so that is our biggest challenge in terms of what it looks like on the ground. The conflict dynamics are extremely complex with different groups in different territories, and that makes access negotiations also very challenging. But as I mentioned, this is what we need the most right now, is this unfettered humanitarian access, but also for the international community to not forget about Sudan in the midst of different crises that are happening around the world, because the attention needs to be on Sudan just as much, because this conflict and this humanitarian catastrophe that we're seeing can have wide-reaching regional implications, especially when we see these high numbers of people fleeing over the border to Chad, South Sudan, Ethiopia, countries that are also already so vulnerable. Resources are stretched. And so for regional stability, it is critical that the international community keeps an eye on Sudan and does not forget the Sudanese people in their greatest hour of need.